Hey watch friends, today we're going to check out this prototype from the Malaysian micro brand Revelot, and this is the Mecadromo. This one's launching on their website very shortly after this video is published on August 27th of 2024, and it's going to be directly on their site. I'll of course have a link down in the video description if you care to check that out. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive in. We'll first knock out the basic specs, then we'll get a better feel for what this one's like to actually live with. As far as the case, measured from roughly the 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock position, this one's coming in at 41.5 millimeters. The bezel, for all intents and purposes, is flush. It's coming in at 41.4 millimeters. The lugs are a strap change friendly 22 millimeters. The lug to lug is 47.6 millimeters, so it works just fine even on smaller wrists like mine, as we'll see on the 6.5-inch wrist here shortly. The total thickness is coming in at 12.3 millimeters. However, that is inclusive of this box edge and is actually subtly domed as well, sapphire crystal. So that does definitely thicken it up, as well as that slope bezel that we'll check out here shortly. As I already mentioned, the crystal is sapphire. It does feature an inner air coating and it is box edge with a subtle dome to it. The movement is a Seiko Mecha Quartz, specifically the VK63. For those who are not familiar, I know many of you have complained in the past about hating not having any visible movement with the Mecha Quartz. This one does differ in that it, as you can see at the 6 o'clock, does have a ticking second as well. This does feature, just like the other ones, it's going to be hacking, obviously chronograph functionality here with the pushers as well as the sub-dial layout for that. And then additionally with this, as we'll see, the interesting thing about the Mecha Quartz is you get quartz functionality, as you can see with the ticking second, but you also get the smooth sweep. Let's go ahead and just activate that. You get the smooth sweep with the chronograph function. So that's what's nice there, is it doesn't completely take away. You don't have that ticking with the chrono, which I very much appreciate, even though it's not an automatic movement. The water resistance is coming in at 100 meters or 10 atmospheres. And as far as the weight, on this factory included strap, this is only coming in at 81.8 grams, so not too bad there at all. And let's go ahead and stop that chrono, and then watch that spring back. As you can see, very nice clicks that we'll explore here. So now that we have the basic specs out of the way, let's go ahead and dive deeper into this model and get a sense for what it's like to actually live with. This is available with 10 different color options. So you've got pretty much any kind of choice you could want out there. There's the yellowish version that we're looking at today that is a full loom. There's additionally black versions. I'm not going to pop them all up here, but there's a Bonfire that's a very cool vintage styling. There's a couple dark blue variants. There's a light blue version that does actually have a full loom dial as well. There's a Panda, or a reverse Panda, I guess, that does have full loom there too. And then one of my personal favorites, there's a teal DLC. It's actually black and then with teal accents. Very retro type vibes to a lot of these, and I really appreciate that. As far as the basic layout, these are going to be a tri-compacts layout, and you're going to see that that's consistent, of course, across each of these. So with those 3 sub-dials, we'll explore what each of those does here momentarily. But one of the things that you'll notice is there's a fair amount of depth to this dial. Specifically, those sub-dials are inlaid, and there's actually a chapter ring that's kind of recessed as well. So the center dial really does kind of just pop off of the pop out of there to give you just that little bit more of depth. With this particular variation, as we'll see, and we'll look at some comps here, this is what I would describe as kind of like a Dijon mustard yellow. So it's not a real pure gold, nor is it a pure yellow. It's somewhere in between there, and we'll explore that further. And that's partly owing to this unique loom that this does have for its full loom configuration. At the 12 o'clock position, you can see that this has their brand logo as well as naming, and then the Mecadromo, so no text at the 6 o'clock because of the sub-dial. And then as you move further out, you can see, as we already looked at, there is a chapter ring that is recessed down in there, as you'd expect for a chrono that does have, I believe, 5th second scale, and that kind of alternates back and forth for that, which I think is a cool visual look, and that, of course, has printing into that. As far as the sub-dials themselves, you're going to notice each of these does have kind of a unique theming or layout for it. At the 9 o'clock position, you're going to have your running chrono minutes. At the 3 o'clock position, you're going to have your 24-hour sub-dial, and that's kind of done like a horizon for the which you'd find on a pilot watch. And then at the 6 o'clock position, you're going to see that running second, as well as you will notice this one has kind of a gold coloration to it, and it does have a railroad track actually inlaid into that, and then of course printing that's subtly done on the perimeter of that as well. And then right below that, you can see this does have a date at the 6 o'clock position. It is just a basic circle cutout, which gives an interesting effect, as we'll see, especially with the loom that we'll check out here momentarily. It isn't a color match date wheel, but I think the contrast works well here, especially with those 3 and 9 o'clock sub-dials with featuring some white as well. As far as the hardware, this one features, it's hard to pin down, but I would call it, I guess, like a modified Dauphine. It's similar to that shape, but it is blunted off at the tips, and it doesn't have the traditional Dauphine crease, or at least pronouncedly so. But some of the things that are unique with this is it does have brushing running down the length of it, and that does give some nice light play where sometimes it looks gunmetal, sometimes it looks like a brushed stainless steel or what have you. But one of the things that I haven't seen before, or at least can't readily recall, is in addition to the loom accent, they actually went with kind of tying into the gray hands that you see for the others. At the base, you can see that this actually has some gray coloration. So you notice that there's a different in a split with the loom there. And I think that's a pretty cool touch. As I already mentioned, there are gray hands. So for your chronograph, your primary second hand, or your chronograph running second hand, that's going to be gray, as well as your 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock subdials. And then your running second, as far as for your primary hands, that is going to be at your 6 o'clock. And that is similar finishing to the primary minute and hour hand there. As far as the markers on this are kind of like a wedge shape. So you have a flat top to them, you've got brushing running down, but then you get some nice light play because it does kind of have that wedge on the inner side that does slope down towards the dial. So I think that's nice, and it does give a nice visual touch for that. And I always like, in general, when you have more than just like a plain block, and I think that's well done here and really does pick up some nice light. As far as the loom, and speaking of light, this one is pretty much a torch. So with this having the full loom dial, this glows very prominently. And just like we've seen with some of the past from MMI or otherwise, where they've done kind of like an orangish or orangish yellow full loom dial, this really does transition nicely depending on what the lighting is. You know, if you start to pick up some ambient light, it really shifts where you can't tell that much of a difference between the color of when it's loom versus when it's the daytime dial. And I like that visual effect. But overall, endurance, performance, glow, etc., it's been very solid in that regard. And it does have loom applied to your hour and minute hand, and then your markers, little accents there as well. But certainly the one that steals the show is going to be the dial itself. And then you do get some kind of negative space or negative accent there as you look for your subdials, and you can see that date cutout. And then additionally with the a chronograph hand as that's moving around, that primarily uses the negative light. As far as the bezel, as we already looked at, this is a fixed bezel. It is, for all intents and purposes, flush. It does have a pretty pronounced slope to that. The finishing on this is going to match the case, which in this particular version is a DLC. So you're going to see that this has black all around. You can get, of course, stainless steel. This is 316L stainless steel underneath of that. But as far as the actual bezel insert, you might have noticed that this has a perfectly glossy finish to it. And the reason for that being is this is actually an anodized aluminum. So with having the aluminum, you're able to get, you lose some of the scratch resistance, but you are able to get a nice gloss that you can't really achieve that perfect level of gloss necessarily, or that same type of gloss with a sapphire, or rather with a ceramic insert, and then sapphire you have to rely on underneath. But the biggest thing is that coloration of the anodization. You can see this has like a gold coloration. It doesn't perfectly match the dial, but I think it complements it pretty well, especially when you change out the strap, as we'll look at here shortly. But that is something that's unique to being able to do with anodization. And as far as the actual finishing, you can see that this does have a tachymeter, as you'd probably expect for a chronograph, and then you can see some accent colors towards the 2 o'clock position as well. Shifting over to the case, as already mentioned, this particular one does have DLC coating at 600 Vickers of scratch resistance, so it's going to increase that over just a raw stainless steel like you would have on the other variants. It is a pretty thin mid-case itself, as well as the overall presence is pretty thin for it. It does have horizontal brushing running, so front to rear on that, and that helps with some light play there. I will say, and we'll come back to it, you do definitely get some smudges and stuff still, as is a character of the DLC, so that is not atypical there. There's a pretty decent downturn. It comes pretty well flush with the case back, and it does give some nice visual play, kind of cuts in there and just keeps it from being too much of a slab kind of construction. The lug cuts themselves are pretty aggressive. As you can see, you have not only kind of the wedge cut in there, but then you've got an aggressive cut on the top of the lugs, which gives some visual interest, and then it does cut onto the inside as well. You can see in between the lugs, this does feature polishing, so that really just breaks things up, and I like the way that this works with almost like that black chrome kind of effect that you get with having DLC over that polishing. So I think that's good use of differing textures. And then on the 3 o'clock side, you can see the crown does not have crown guards, which I think that would be a bit too much with all of these pushers and everything that's going on. With the lugs themselves, one of the things that I like is you can actually see with this silhouette, it almost reminds me of like the welded type of lug look. So I think that's a pretty cool vintage touch there as well. As far as the crown itself, this is coming in at 5.8 millimeters. It is just a push-pull configuration. Again, with being a quartz, that's pretty well what you'd expect there. The pushers themselves, you can see, have a nice undercutting, which gives a unique visual touch to them compared to some others, and we already saw the action. It is nice, pronounced click for that very satisfying, good tactile feel. As far as the crown, so in addition to its push-pull, you can see that this does have gear cut, and then on the outside, you can see that it does have their logo, pretty common for the Revelot, and it is nicely milled down in there, and then of course a little bit of a texture difference between that as well, and then of course carrying over with that DLC finishing. Shifting over to the case back. The case back on this is a screw-in construction. It is going to be, even with this DLC version, still just a stainless steel, so an uncoated stainless steel. It is principally going to be brushing. However, with all of that milled etching that you have in the back, that does pick up with some blasting to really give some nice contrast for that. On the perimeter, you can see that this does have nice clean text all the way around there, and it gives you just the basic information. And then that logo in the middle complements nicely with the logo that we saw on the crown, and I think it's just a good, nice touch. And then the thinness is pretty thin overall for the case back, which that helps it to nest nicely on the wrist, which I always appreciate. Shifting over to the strap, this stock included strap is going to be tapered from 22 millimeters at the lugs down to 20 millimeters at the buckle. So it has a 2 millimeter taper overall. This particular variant, you're going to see all of them, I believe, have the racing kind of perforations in that, so very vintage styling for that. And then this particular one has yellow accented stitching as well, so inlays of yellow in the racing holes or perforation holes, as well as the yellow stitching. I don't personally think it goes overly well with the dial or particularly with the bezel. However, that's going to be down to taste, but we'll revisit that one. It does have quick release spring bars on the back, so that makes it nice and easy to change this out. And then for the buckle, it does have a signed as well as either a PVD or DLC, but a matching black buckle for that as well. So that ties in nicely. I personally wore this most on an Artem sailcloth strap, and that actually went with just a straight black variant for that. I personally appreciate a little more toned down, especially with as much punch and pop as you have on this particular color variant. So I think it suits it a little better, but again, we'll revisit that. Alright, so now that we have a better feel for this one, what it's like on my 6.5 inch wrist, overall specs, that kind of stuff, let's go ahead and bring in some comps. First, here is one we checked out relatively recently. This is the Wayforth Voyager, and as you can see here, this is another chronograph. You can see kind of the difference in the colors here, with this being more of a true traditional mustard yellow, whereas this is like a Dijon mustard yellow. Gives you an idea there. Same thing with this one also being 41, gives you an idea of the sizing with kind of that internal rotating bezel. Bringing in another yellow just to give you an idea. This one is a RZE, and this is specifically the Endeavor. And you can see this is a pretty similar yellow to the last one we saw, but this gives you an idea as far as 41 millimeters in kind of more of a dive styling for that. And then finally, just bringing in another Revelot. So this is checking out, many of you might already know this one, the Hex Mariner. Specifically, this is the Hex Mariner 42, and then this is that white meteorite version. Gives you an idea there as far as sizing, as kind of what to expect. As you can see, this is a much chunkier look to this visually, but as far as the overall dial presence, pretty similar between the two. Alright, so now that we have all of that out of the way, you should have a pretty good feel for this watch, but let's go ahead and wrap things up with my personal view of the positives, critiques, as well as the summary. First, for the positives, we haven't talked about the pricing. This actually starts at launch at $189, and it goes to this one being the most expensive of any of them at $229. So that really, to me, is a pretty fantastic value for what we get. And we'll unpack that further as we go through the rest of these, but one of those things is going to be the solid finishing. I've got to say, for around the $200 price point, it's slightly above or slightly under that price point, I think the finishing is plenty respectable and plenty solid. I think you get a pretty good watch for the money. This one definitely oozes vintage racing vibes, and especially depending on which ones you go with. If you look at like the Le Mans and those kinds of versions, I really just think that those scream vintage for the overall aesthetic, and I appreciate that look. On the wrist, these are pretty comfortable. Beyond the lightweight, I think the sizing is pretty versatile for it. Works just fine on my 6.5 inch wrist. It'll have plenty of presence for larger wrists. It could go a little smaller in wrist size as well, but I think it's a pretty versatile. And then the loom. This one has very strong loom, as we already looked at and explored, particularly with the dial. So really no complaints there. Nicely done. But what about some critiques? As I already alluded to, the strap choice, personally, this would not have been my pick for this variant. Not only do I think the strap itself, I think feels a little bit cheap, though leather's not my thing anyways. But that being said, I think the yellow is just a bit too much. I think it clashes with the dial, or with the bezel rather, more so than the bezel and the dial. And when you change this over to a black, I think it all just feels more cohesive. So I would have changed that around. For date alignment, as you can see, with this 25, it is pretty well aligned. However, I noticed with like the 21 and some different ones, it can be a little bit staggered or biased towards the 9 o'clock side, so the alignment isn't perfect, at least on this prototype. That might have been cleaned up on the production version. Again, it's not for every date there, because you can see the 25 is well spot on, but it's something I noticed. And then I already mentioned earlier, just a very minor thing, and it's more just something to be aware of for characteristic. DLC, it is always going to be somewhat of a smudge magnet, so even with brushing where that tends to hide oils a little bit better, this, anytime you touch it, it will show smudges all over. So just something to be aware of, not something to fault for Revelot. That is just a characteristic of DLC, but something I want you to be aware of if you're thinking about which version to go with, or if you want your first DLC watch. So where does that leave us? In summary, I think with a huge color range of having 10 different options available, the price point that's extremely reasonable at or around $200 for it, I really don't think you can go wrong. So if you like the styling of this, I think you get a very solid watch and very solid value for the money. So I would definitely encourage you to go ahead and consider grabbing one if you like any of these styles. So I hope this has been helpful for you. If you did enjoy it, do drop a comment. Let me know what you think. Do you like the model? Which version is your favorite? All that kind of good stuff. And if you haven't already done so, tap that like button and smash that subscribe button. Stay tuned, always have new content coming. Thanks for watching.